Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. Hope everybody had a chance to get some coffee and keep awake. So this session is session 1B, injury prevention. So we have five great presenters this afternoon, starting with Janet Aucoin, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary studying epidemiology, and her doctoral research is supported through funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and Alberta Innovates. Her PhD thesis focuses on child bicyclist injury prevention and the built environment through the use of innovative care or innovative case crossover design, while also incorporating the child's perspective on bicycling safety through qualitative interviews. So welcome, Janet.
Test. There we go. All righty. Thanks so much, Julie. As mentioned, I'm going to be chatting with you today about some of my research that looks at child bicyclist injuries and their injured child bicyclists and their perceptions of safety. And what we did is we applied the Haddon's matrix to some qualitative data that we had as part of the larger bike study that I'm doing for my PhD. And I do want to quickly acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Branion-Calles, as well as my honors student, Serena Ariel, who helped out with a lot of this research. Oh, and it's not working. There we go. Alrighty, so bicycling can be extremely beneficial for the physical, mental health of our children. However, in the past few decades, we have seen a decline in participation. And part of this is due to some concerns surrounding traffic-related injury and safety. And unfortunately, these concerns are founded, as bicycling injuries remain a leading cause of injury, both sport and recreation, as well as when we think about transportation injuries at a larger scale. And what we know is that children do disproportionately carry the burden of transportation injuries and injuries that we see here in Canada. And when we're thinking about bicycling participation, we know that it's largely influenced by their perceptions of safety. So we do need to start considering the perspective of the child as we are looking to explore additional strategies to address child bicyclist injury and safety. And one of these ways is actually starting to talk to the children themselves. So typically when we're thinking about injury prevention, a lot of what we think about are some of those more quantitative approaches that we have seen. However, introducing some more qualitative research methods might provide additional insights into our understanding of child bicyclist injuries that otherwise might not be captured. In fact, Article 12 from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child actually provides a really strong rationale for incorporating the child's voice into injury prevention research, as it actually states that children have the right to express their views and be listened to in any matters pertaining to their health and well-being, including safety. Right now, there's currently a bit of a gap in the literature when we think about injury prevention that looks at child bicyclist safety perceptions. And one way that we might be able to bridge this gap and get a bit more into the qualitative realm is to use what's called a conceptual framework. So Haddon's matrix is a framework and tool that hopefully most of you are familiar with. It's widely used in the field of injury prevention, and it's primarily been used more in the quantitative realm and as we're thinking about interventions. For those who aren't as familiar with the framework, what it does is it actually conceptualizes injuries as being both predictable and preventable, meaning they're not accidents. And as you can see here, the rows of the matrix refer to different points in time. So that's pre-event, event, and post-event. These can loosely also be interpreted almost as pre-injury, injury, and post-injury phases. And then the columns at the top of the matrix represent the different factors that influence injury and were originally informed actually by the epidemiologic triad of host, agent, and environment. And we can adapt these a bit to the different contexts that we're exploring injury. But of note here, the agent here for our understanding of injury, that's the object or the vehicle that is carrying the energy that causes an injury. So Haddon's matrix, we hope, can provide a promising bridge into some of our more qualitative understanding and different methods in the field, particularly through applying it to child bicyclist interview data. So the objectives of this study first was to explore injured child bicyclists' perceptions of safety and their environment using the Haddon's matrix, and to assess whether this framework realistically can be applied to qualitative data. So what did we do? We recruited 40 participants who sustained a bicycling injury and presented to one of 3 emergency departments across Canada, the BC Children's Hospital in Vancouver, Alberta Children's Hospital in Calgary, and Sick Kids in Toronto. I do want to note these participants were recruited through a much larger, the Pike study that was at each of these hospitals, and then were asked to participate in an additional qualitative component at the end. And we did this for from about May 2021 to October 2021. And what that meant is all of our interviews with these children were virtual and they were done over Zoom. So please keep that in mind. So these children, and often their accompanying parents, completed short, open-ended interviews where they were asked pretty general questions about bicycling safety and injury risk, such as, why are reasons you think children might be getting hurt while bicycling? What makes you feel safe or unsafe while bicycling? So the children's responses were then transcribed and coded independently by 2 different coders. And you can see here the breakdown of the different interviews across the 3 cities, as well as the fact that the majority of our sample was male and the ages were ranged between 5 to 16. So to approach this qualitative research, I used what's called a framework approach. And so this is in the same family as a thematic content analysis, if you're familiar with it. And what it allows for is a very structured approach to linking codes and themes to a framework, such as the Haddon's matrix. So we used what's called a hybrid approach to coding, where our deductive codes were informed by the Haddon's matrix. So those were our rows and columns in the matrix, were our deductive codes. And then we also allowed for inductive codes to emerge. So that's different factors that children identified as being related to their safety. So what we found, just at a higher level from our codes, those numbers there represent the number of inductive codes that we found within the Haddon's matrix. And what you can see is that children really were able to recognize and identify factors across all the different phases and across all the different columns of the matrix. They really do have a wide understanding of the variety of factors that can influence child bicyclist injury. I do want to point out that we did change the columns of the matrix slightly. So you can see we added intrapersonal and interpersonal, and then vehicle being the object carrying the energy, to modify slightly to our context. So I do want to point out, you can see the majority of these codes emerged at the pre-injury phase, as well as in the physical environment column. So these are the results that I'm going to be sharing today, but I am happy to chat afterwards if you're interested in some of our results in those other columns. So what did we find? Motor vehicles. This was a major theme that emerged. And the big one here is children want to be separated from motor vehicles. And when I say this was perhaps our largest theme, what I mean by that is that every single one of those 40 children mentioned wanting to be separated from a motor vehicle in some way. So that's not just one of the 40. Every single child we spoke to recognized that being close to a car, being close to a motor vehicle influenced their safety. So that's a huge, children are very capable of recognizing that. And that was a big theme that we found. And you can see here that first quote, I'm going to have cars killing my end or coming up and clipping me on the side. This is my lane, and I know I'm not supposed to interact with anyone else in the lane. So they want their own spaces. They want to be separated from cars. Speed. A lot of children mentioned the speed of motor vehicles as issues pertaining to their safety and concerning for them. Another one is an awareness of a bicyclist. So having motor vehicle drivers actually be aware of bicyclists in their area. So you can see here a child describing someone making a right turn on red when the child has the right of way, and them feeling unsafe due to that, or not being visible, and the child being forced to go out further into the road than maybe they'd be comfortable to avoid the interaction with the car or to avoid getting hit. So motor vehicles was a key emerging theme. Another one is route design and how we design our routes. Maybe children didn't use the exact wording of route design, but a lot of what they talked about did fall into these different areas. So grade was a big one. So downhill, uphill, children frequently spoke as this being concerning to them, particularly downhill areas are where they feel most unsafe. So you can see here a child speaks about that sense of loss of control when they're going downhill, of they go fast, they're not able to control themselves quite as much, or they talk about feeling gravity push them down when they're going uphill. They also spoke a lot about visibility. So whether or not they could see what was coming, whether they were visible in space, the visibility of infrastructure was a lot about what they spoke about as well. And then intersections as well, and intersections being spaces that they felt a lot more unsafe compared to other locations. As well as surface. So what earlier I mentioned that motor vehicle and that separation from motor vehicle, perhaps the one that was the most mentioned, second most mentioned, was gravel. So debris was a big one for children, and gravel, I'd say probably about 35 of our 40 children mentioned gravel. And you can see here, they articulate when there's lots of gravel, that's the biggest enemy. So for children, gravel and that presence is a key concern for them, as well as surface quality. So whether or not there's bumps in the road, potholes, and this child at the bottom articulates very nicely that leading up to the intersection, there's a giant pothole, and they're forced to leave their bike lane and go into the road and then back into the lane due to that surface quality. Surface type did emerge, but this one also emerged, interestingly enough, at the injury phase. So surface type more in relation to injury mitigation. So once the event has occurred, do I fall on a soft surface? Do I fall on grass? Do I fall on concrete? And those different surface types and how it could impact their injury. So in terms of applying the Haddon's matrix to qualitative data, we found it was an incredibly useful framework for not only allowing that preliminary and that initial deductive coding, but also in allowing us to understand the qualitative data, particularly in the field of injury prevention. One limitation I do want to highlight that we found in using the Haddon's matrix in a more structured manner for those deductive codes is that it might not fully capture some of the relationships between those different columns, as it does provide a bit of a silo between all of those different columns. However, as I'm doing right now, you can take additional steps within that framework analysis to explore some of those relationships across that further. So some key takeaways from this study is that children have very real and very valid concerns over their safety when bicycling. And these concerns need to start being listened to and taken seriously, and particularly incorporated into any future child injury prevention research and interventions that we are doing. So in this study, the key points are that children consistently identified motor vehicles and a lack of separation from motor vehicles as key issues related to feeling unsafe, as well as they have concerns about surface quality and debris. And these were the ones that were mentioned most frequently by the children. So this research, as I mentioned, is part of the much larger bike study, which actually, that's a quantitative study. And what this allows us to do is do a bit of mixed methods research and actually triangulate our qualitative and quantitative results in order to compare and validate some of the findings. So I will also be presenting on Tuesday some of the quantitative findings from the bike study, where, spoiler alert, you'll actually be able to see that many of the factors identified by the children as risk factors were also identified by the bike study as risk factors. So what this means is children really are able to recognize very real risk factors and articulate them very well. So it's my hope that this research opens up the door to beginning to incorporate the child's voice into research and any matters pertaining to their safety. So I do want to acknowledge that this study is part of the larger CHASE project occurring across Canada, and I will open it up to questions and leave you with my favorite quote from this study of, when I'm biking and when I'm on the sidewalk, I feel unsafe. I know I'm supposed to be on the road, but cars make me feel unsafe. And so this just highlights that children need spaces where they can bike in safe ways, and we need to start working towards that. So thank you all very much for your time, and I will open this up to questions. Yes, go ahead. It depends on the city. So specifically in Calgary, it's 14. I believe Toronto is also 14. Vancouver doesn't have an age. Vancouver has a wheel size. Now, these are bylaws that aren't monitored quite as much, but absolutely, even sidewalks. Children spoke about interacting with pedestrians, with other bicyclists, with debris on the sidewalks, people putting their trash cans on those sidewalks. So if we can create bike lanes, bike paths that are built for children and give children or bicyclists a space, I think that was largely what they were getting at here. But that's a great point. Yes, it does differ by age. Yeah.
Purposeful as they would design their systems to actually take into account
Child's perspective. From my knowledge, I have not come across that. I know it is an emerging field, though. There are some nonprofits that have started working with children to help co-design spaces in front of schools. So there's some neat research coming out that does start incorporating the child, but from the top of my head, I'm not aware of quite as many who are actually incorporating the child's voice, which is fortunate. We heard a lot of presentations this morning talk about how children disproportionately are affected by injuries and they carry the burden. So we need to talk to them.
So just thinking aloud here.
Yeah.
What would you recommend in the injury department that you'd like to take into account the child's perspective as a youth?
I would recommend finding ways to talk to those road users, whether it's at a school, if you're doing some road design in front of a school, talking to the children who use them. I know in Calgary, we recently saw our speed reduction on residential roads from 50 to 40. I know off the top of my head, I hadn't attended a lot of those city council meetings. Children weren't present for those discussions. We could have been talking to them. They're the ones on our residential roads. So I would say as much as possible, reach out to groups. I know there's some leadership groups of children at different high schools who are looking to get involved. There's a number that I know of in Calgary that are actually looking to get involved in road safety and talk to engineers. So absolutely, I'd say maybe high school students, but even the younger ones we saw were able to articulate that. Yeah. And they also do some of the co-design. They have children draw out their ideal street, and then they take that to engineers to then find a happy medium. And so some of those streets are really neat. Calgary yesterday had an open street with one of those co-designed streets. So that was really neat to see. Yeah. Any other questions? If not, my contact is on the slide there. I'm happy to answer any additional questions related to this research. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Janet. Our next presenter is Dr. Michael Branion-Calles. Michael is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of British Columbia. He's interested in using geographical and/or epidemiological approaches and novel data sets to answer applied questions at the intersection of transportation, safety, and health. So welcome, Michael.
put that on here. Isn't that? Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you can just adjust the mic.
Okay. Is it on or?
It should be okay. Can you do a test?
Test. Hello?
Just a little bit.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. My name is Michael Branion-Calles, and I'm a postdoc at UBC, and I'm going to be presenting on some research I did at Toronto Metropolitan University, which hopefully will be finishing up soon, using the Canadian Census Health and Environment Cohorts, which is a database, a linked database from Statistics Canada to look at risk factors for transportation injury and mortality. So just a little bit of context. With traditional injury data sets for transportation, particularly for cyclists and pedestrians, these data sets underreport incidents and tend to be biased towards specific kinds of crashes, particularly those with motor vehicles. And it's difficult to use these data sets to look at risk factors beyond sort of just age and gender, and to combine them with different estimates of exposure. So how much somebody is using a particular mode or population is using a particular mode. And so the Canadian Census Health and Environment Cohort is a database from Statistics Canada that only recently has sort of been linked to health outcomes that we can use to ascertain injury. But in general, it's essentially a database that looks at long form census and links it to health outcomes. So traditionally it's just been mortality and cancer registry that it's been linked to. But they've also now linked to DAD, so the Discharge Abstract Database, which is hospitalizations, NACRS, which is emergency visits, and then obviously we can also use mortal or mortality databases as well. And so it's a very large data set as it and representative as it is from the census. So yeah, the aim of this particular research was to sort of leverage this linked data set to explore national differences in hospital admissions and mortality risks between different population groups. This particular study is a little bit more limited in scope than we had initially planned on due to difficulties with COVID and accessing the data to begin with. But yeah, so hopefully we can talk a little bit about that going forward. So for our purposes, we have 4 iterations of the CanCHEC cohorts. We have the long form census from 1996, 2001, 2006, and the National Household Survey from 2011. And then we have mortality data as well as hospitalization data that has been linked to. The emergency department data is difficult to use and is only really, you can only ascertain what the type of injury somebody has, or the mechanism of injury in certain provinces. So we're unable to use that. So that's just Ontario and Alberta where we could do that. So it's restricted just to mortality and hospitalization. And we essentially just looked at identifying cases for people who filled out the long form census in these different years between 1996 and 2018 for mortality data, and between 2006 and 2018 for hospitalization data. And so we have essentially sort of 2 different health outcome severities that we're looking at. We have hospitalizations and we have mortalities. And for the hospitalization data, it's only linked from using the 2006 and 2011 National Household Survey. Whereas for mortality data, we have more years to look at. So from 1996 to 2011. And so our sample, it only includes people who were currently employed on the day of the census, or in at least employed at some point in the in that year. We don't include residents of territories or with the hospitalization residents of Quebec because they either have variables that are suppressed due to privacy concerns or they don't submit data to DAD in the case of Quebec. So the main population characteristics that we looked at were the main mode of commute from the journey to work module in the census and national household survey. So this is just a question that asks what's your primary mode of commute for the current job that you have or the last job you had up until the January prior. And then age at the time of the census, sex, a low income cutoff, whether you're above or below that cutoff, which varies based on household size and region, whether or not you're a visible minority, and whether you're a recent immigrant. And we use a definition of 10 years, which was a compromise. 5 years is usually the cutoff, but we needed more data to be able to take it out of the secure data center. And so this is just a figure that looks at the different windows for different cohorts for identifying cases, whether that's hospitalization or mortality. And so it's time on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is the different cohorts going from 1996 to 2011. And so this is just sort of like the follow-up times that we have for identifying hospitalization or mortality due to transportation purposes. So sort of following up on that, we have kind of 6 different models. So we can move this out of the way here. There we go. So we looked at whether or not somebody was hospitalized or killed as a cyclist, a pedestrian, or in a car, truck, or van. And then we also then looked at whether they're hospitalized or killed as a pedestrian or bicyclist or in a car, truck, or van. So there's sort of 2 severity outcomes and 3 different modes that we looked at comparing. And we used ICD codes to identify these cases. So we used a pretty broad definition, so it includes in-traffic and out-of-traffic incidents for bicyclists and pedestrians anyways. Well, car, truck, or vans as well, but I guess that's more rare. And then we used a Cox proportional hazard model to look at the time. So basically just to compare the rate of injury between these different groups. And we ran minimal and mutually adjusted models. And I'm just going to be presenting the results from the mutually adjusted model, which just means that all of the coefficients were adjusted for each other, for each other independent variable. So our cohort here are slightly different for the hospitalizations and mortality in terms of the distribution of the different variables, or I should say they're very similar. The biggest difference obviously is that there's just more people in the mortality database because we have more years of census to draw upon. So there's 129 million person years compared to 39 million. So there's just over 2,000 hospitalizations for pedestrians, 4,500 for bicyclists, and over 10,000 for car, truck, or van hospitalizations. And just under 1,000 pedestrian deaths, just over 200 bicyclists, and 3,000 car, truck, or van deaths. And so the mortality cohort, it takes place over a longer period of time, so 1996 to 2018, whereas the hospitalization is just 2006 to 2018. And I guess that's pretty difficult to see from out there, but essentially most people have stated that they use a car, truck, or van around 80% between both of these cohorts as their main mode of commute. And we kind of underrepresent senior citizens or older adults due to only including employed people. Otherwise, nothing too remarkable here. And so this is sort of the full results, which is, I'll kind of try and break this down here, but on the x-axis, we have hospitalization risks and then fatality risks for different modes. So the first column is car, truck, or van. And hospitalization and then fatality. Red squares indicate an increased risk, and blue squares are a decreased risk or a protective effect. What you can kind of get out of this is that for each of these, in sort of the x-axis is the different levels of different variables. So for example, the primary mode of commute, your risks of being hospitalized or killed while using a car, truck, or van are much lower for those who use alternative modes as their primary mode of commute, which is good. It means that variable is probably capturing differences in exposure somewhat well. Similarly, for bicyclists, you're much higher risk of being hospitalized, 9 times higher if your primary main mode of commute was a bicycle. And so to me, this sort of means that it's capturing these differences in exposure in a way that we would expect if that variable was meaningful in measuring what it's supposed to measure. One of the things that was also interesting that was for pedestrians, the risks were equal amongst people whose main mode of commute was cycling or walking or other mode. Not equal, but elevated relative to car, truck, or vans. And it wasn't like particularly higher for people who stated that they walk to work, which makes sense because you walk, everybody walks for different reasons. Just because you walk to work doesn't mean you're going to walk more in general. And so perhaps that's not a good way of sort of segmenting the population into who walks more or less. And then for age cohorts, it's sort of U-shaped most of the time, or sort U-shaped for pedestrians in that younger people are higher risk as well as older people. And in general, older adults are lower risk than younger for motor vehicle risks or for cycling, other than actually we have fatalities that increase, that risk increases with age. So it's not consistent across the board for age. Men are much higher risk, and as well as low income populations. And then within this visible minority category, we have, this is very coarse category of ethnicity that Statistics Canada collects. And I'll note that the term of Aboriginal is Statistics Canada word that's used in the census. So maybe not the most inclusive or accurate term, but it is what is used in the actual census. And what we found is that people who self-identify as a visible minority tend to be at lower risks for across different modes relative to non-visible minorities. But in general, people who self-identified as Aboriginal had much higher elevated risks of hospitalization and fatality for motor vehicle occupants, as well as for walking, less so for cycling. And recent immigration also was generally less higher risk than people who had not recently immigrated. Yeah, so that's sort of the full model results there. So there are a lot of limitations to this data. We have imperfect measurement of exposure. We have no time varying variables. So behavior that changes over time, we don't capture. We haven't integrated any measures from the built environment in this particular analysis, although that is possible with CanCHEC using linkages to postal code data. So potentially fruitful avenues in the future to explore. And yeah, we need further research into these inequities in road trauma. So sort of discussion and contributions. This is a pretty novel data set exploring almost national differences in trends in injury. One of the main results we see is that injury is occurring disproportionately within historically disadvantaged populations, including low-income groups and Indigenous people, which is pretty consistent with a lot of the research that's around the world. And that the census main mode of commute is somewhat consistent with expected trends in terms of what we would expect if that was capturing sort of meaningful differences in behavior, transportation behavior. Yeah, and that's it. Thanks very much.
Does anybody have any questions?
Hi.
Can I understand you correctly that newcomers are at less risk than people who have been for a long time?
Yes. Well, we kind of have it's people who have immigrated to Canada within 10 years of them taking the census. So the reference group is both people who were born here and people who have immigrated later, so have been here for at least 10 years. So
But what I understood was that people who have immigrated within the last 10 years are safer than people who have been here longer term.
yeah, that's the association we found.
I have to say that really surprises me because I work with a lot of newcomer groups, and that's not the anecdotal information that I'm hearing.
Yeah, and it might not be reflective of the actual like risk when you adjust for the amount of travel actually being conducted within these different groups, because we only had what is your main mode of commute is like a coarse way of adjusting for that variable, but there still might be differences when you actually are able to measure either the distance or the time traveled within these different populations. So it could be that we're overestimating the exposure within these groups, that newcomers maybe use these different modes much less frequently. And then when you look at that injury risk, it might be actually a lot higher than what it would be if you just looked at if you just assumed that they had the same amount of exposure. So that could be part of the reason why. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and so the less than 5 is what we planned on doing, but we couldn't, as per our email exchange, we couldn't get that out. But when I looked at those results, they're basically the same. It was the same trend, even when we had that originally. So yeah, I'm not really sure why that is. I think it probably has to do with the exposure measurement that we have. Yeah. Yes, Anne.
I guess I would say that another thing, you think about what the comparison is that we're looking at, when you compare within cities, who's at risk, you can see there's geographic differences. Compare across the whole country, where you might see a slightly different thing in population because of the different choice and opportunities for options for transportation. The differences of transportation that people use because of the options that they have might be different when you actually are able to compare directly to users. There may be different risks, especially if you incorporate that.
Yeah. I mean, that's also a really good point that I should probably build into the paper, is this idea of huge differences in regions and provinces and geographic differences. So this is just aggregated to the national level. So there's a lot of room for variation across the province, or across the country. So it could very well be the case that in Vancouver or in Toronto, newcomers are at much higher risk, but in other areas they're not. And when you look at that effect aggregated out over all these different geographic regions, that's the conclusion you come to. So. All right, thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Our next presenter is Dr. Ian Pike, who's a professor of pediatrics at the University of British Columbia investigator and co-lead of the Evidence to Innovation research theme at the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute, director of the BC Injury Research and Prevention Unit, and scientific director and spokesperson for the Community Against Preventable Injuries, a not-for-profit injury prevention social marketing organization. So his current research is focused on the determinants of injury, including deprivation and risky play, linkages between unintentional and inflicted injury as a means to creating a safety-oriented culture, child passenger safety, fire-related injury prevention, and the efficacy of a social marketing campaign to reduce serious injury and death.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to speak this afternoon on the cost of transport-related injuries in Canada as assessed in the year 2018. This data is drawn from a larger report that is produced periodically by Parachute, the National Organization for Injury Prevention in Canada, and work that we did in partnership with them. When I say we, I mean the BC Injury Research and Prevention Unit, because the cost of injury has been a particular interest in our research endeavor in British Columbia. So the cost of injury in Canada report quantifies the cost of injury from a societal perspective, and it presents data at a national level, in this case for the year 2018. The purpose of the report was to determine and present the most current costs of injury in Canada in economic terms and in terms of deaths, hospitalizations, emergency department visits, and disabilities. While the report presents data on all injuries, what I'm going to present today are highlights that focus on the transport-related incidents. The analysis was conducted using something called an incidence costing human capital approach. So the population of those people who were injured in 2018 in a transport incident were costed over the balance of their lifetime using a life expectancy of 75 years. The unit costs for the burden on the healthcare system, whether it's a hospital admission, whether it's a death, whether it's an emergency department visit, come from the Canadian Institutes for Health Information. And so that's our highest order in terms of the gold standard for costing here in Canada. And those data are incorporated into our calculations whenever possible, in addition to other cost data that we determine from the literature from around the world. The total costs in this case include both direct cost and indirect costs. Direct costs are composed of all of the goods and services used for the diagnosis, treatment, continuing care, rehabilitation, and the terminal care of a person treated for injury. On the other hand, indirect costs are losses to societal productivity, which account for the injured individual's inability to perform their activities of daily living and to contribute to society. The value of lost production in this case was estimated for the working age population comprising individuals from the ages 15 to 64, which is a standard in Canada. This discriminates, as you can tell, against the older individual who now continues to work, which probably needs adjustment in this country because many older individuals after, quote, normal retirement age are continuing to work out of choice or necessity. Contrary to many other transport-related cost studies that you may be familiar with and that you've seen previously in the literature, our study does not include property damage. from an injury perspective, as a public health issue, we're just very, very interested in the costs that are exerted on the healthcare system and those that result basically because of long-term disability. So data on the injury cases were obtained from the Public Health Agency of Canada and Statistics Canada. Specifically, we're drawing from emergency department visits from the National Ambulatory Care Reporting System database. Hospitalizations are drawn from the Discharge Abstract database. Most people know it as the DAD. And deaths from Vital Statistics dataset. These are the ICD-10 codes that relate to the particular types of injuries and modes of transport that are included in this cost analysis. And so you can see that we have pedestrians, pedal cyclists, those who are in motor vehicles, on ATVs or snowmobiles, and other forms of land transport. The report uses the electronic resource allocation tool. The ERAT is an electronic algorithm, essentially. It provides a classification and a framework combining the various costs that we have got from CanCHEC along with others to give us an overall total. The ERAT was developed in about 2008-09 by the Smart Risk Foundation. It has been used in subsequent costing reports, and so there is consistent reliability across this. In the 2014 report, they worked in partnership with the Conference Board of Canada, who spent a great deal of time validating the ERAT as a costing framework and mechanism for continued use. So there is some confidence in how ERAT can generate and sum these costs for us. If you're interested, there is more information about this approach and the ERAT, the data sources and the limitations, and they're all detailed in the methodology section of the full cost of injury report that you can locate on Parachute's website. So what did we find? The total cost of injury in 2018 amounted to almost $30 billion, okay, $29.4 billion. Of that, 20.4 billion, or 70% of that cost, was directly related to services provided by the healthcare system. And as a public health issue, those of us who work in injury prevention and trot out the 90% of all of these things are entirely predictable and preventable, this means that there's a heck of a lot of resource that's being utilized within the healthcare system that, if prevented, could be reallocated to other pressing needs, ones that perhaps aren't as plastic or malleable to prevention as are injuries. The total cost of transport injuries in 2018 was computed to be 3.6 billion, of which 2.2 were in direct healthcare related costs and 1.4 in indirect. So not a trivial amount, certainly less, however, than you may have seen in many other road-related costing reports that typically include property damage as a major component in the costing. They also include a lot of the policing and justice costs as well, because of course, when there's a car crash, there's a whole bunch of costs attracted. But as I mentioned earlier on, for reasons that injury prevention public health workers are interested, we confine our analysis just to the health-related costs. But transportation injuries in 2018, for the social costs here, were the fourth leading cause of injury-related deaths in Canada, and these were behind falls, suicide, and unintentional poisoning. However, the disabilities, hospitalizations, and emergency department visits were all second only to falls. And because of the broad nature of the category of falls across all ages, you can imagine that there might be more of them. So transport-related hospitalizations, ED, and disabilities are exerting a huge impact on the healthcare system, and one that we think we should be trying to address in a very real way. We also recognize that producing this kind of report with the costs and the economic arguments is often very attractive to decision makers and politicians who want to know what the cost is and what the potential return on investment might be for preventive efforts. Older adults and young adults had the highest rates of hospitalized injury and death from transport incidents when we look at the social cost. And when we break the age groups down further, older adults aged 85 and up had the highest rate of transport-related deaths and hospitalization. I think frailty comes into the equation there, followed by those aged 75 to 84. And then our young adults, 20 to 24, for me, a huge concern, because this is an age group with so much potential ahead of them. And not only are we losing their potential as future whatever they want to be, it's costing an incredible amount of money. And the economists are not only concerned about them not reaching their future, they're concerned about the loss of their contribution to the economy. Transport incidents were the leading cause of injury-related death amongst children up to the age 14. And for youth and young adults aged 15 to 24, transport incidents were the third leading cause of fatalities overall. Yet I think we just see all of this lost potential as a consequence of these injuries. And as you might imagine, males accounted for the vast majority of this concern at around 70%. Motor vehicle collisions were the biggest contributor to injuries and injury costs in terms of economic terms. Injuries related to motor vehicles, including cars, trucks, vans, buses, and motorcycles, accounted for 53% of the costs at 1.9 billion. Hospitalizations, 53% of hospitalizations as well, and 30% of deaths. Of the total cost for motor vehicle injuries, over 1.3 billion was driven by direct costs compared to 543 in indirect. So it's the direct costs and this load on the healthcare system once again that we want to try and address. And you can see here the costs for pedestrians, pedal cyclists, and other road or transport users at far less than those costs associated with motor vehicles and motor vehicle occupants. So the conclusions made by our group, at least, transport injuries in Canada have an immense human and economic toll, costing about 1,800 lives and $3.6 billion in a single year. They disproportionately affect children, youth, and older adults, and cause needless suffering to individuals and families that cannot be quantified in terms of those indirect costs. These injuries use resources that could otherwise be allocated to other essential health services, those that are more difficult to try and solve. More importantly, these injuries, as I've said, are associated with costs that we believe are for the most part entirely preventable. So eliminating the serious injuries and death from transport incidents is going to require, in our analysis, continued advocacy for policy, regulations, and standards that create a safer system for all road users. Investment in evidence-based preventive measures is a necessity. We're often troubled as injury prevention researchers that there is no category for injury prevention research at the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. It's just not a priority. And compared to the burden, it being the leading cause of death for all Canadians aged 1 to 44, I think there's a real mismatch. And so that advocacy and that investment is something that we believe is essential. And while we're doing that investment in, and continued research and evaluation on what works, following investments would be where we need to go. Transport incidents continue to be a leading cause of injury and death in Canada, despite progress made over the last several decades. The Cost of Injury in Canada report quantifies this issue in economic and human terms, and we believe is a tool that can be used by road safety professionals for data-driven priority setting and to communicate with policymakers and other decision makers the importance of this issue and the value of investment in prevention. Thank you. I'm not sure if there are any questions. Anne.
Yeah, I'm sure you have a way, part of your advocacy is to say, likely a conservative estimate of the cost, and I'm sure you have many reasons for that. And I just have one more from Alice. When you mentioned transport injuries coming second to falls, and falls being that huge catch-all, did you look at all at the fact that some pedestrian injuries end up coded as falls in the system, so that?
Yeah, we haven't done that very detailed analysis because I'm going to say because of some of the problems with the data coding itself. And so we sort of stick to the categories that the coders have given us. And but I mean, individual chart reviews and so on could probably help us make that analysis far more robust. Yes. Yes. Yeah, we do. And I think that there's a sort of a decision made here to be conservative and truthful without overblowing the cost to get somebody's attention. And for us, you know, $29.4 billion is no trivial sum. And even if that's a conservative amount, and we do obtain any kind of return on investment, and those of you who've looked at this before, you know the massive returns on investments for each dollar invested. I mean, the one that comes to my mind all the time that CanCHEC has trotted out is for every bicycle helmet sold that protects a kid from a severe head injury at a cost of about $30 or $40, a sum of $2,800 per day in rehabilitation costs is avoided. That's a magnificent sum of money at the end of the year for a $40 investment. Okay, and so this again is CanCHEC data. There are, of course, those same kinds of ROIs that come out of CDC at, you know, child-proof lighters at $80, child passenger safety seats at $70, $80 return on the dollar invested. So these are, you know, these are big wins. I think that the idea is to continue to gather the attention of those politicians and the people who invest in injury research in this country to cause the investment so that those ROIs could be achieved. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ian. So I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Mohim Halari. Mohim is a medical graduate with a passion for research in forensic medicine. He has a master's degree in forensic medical sciences from Queen Mary University of London and a diploma in forensic human identification offered by the Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine at the Royal College of Physicians of London. He now conducts research currently in his fourth year PhD under Dr. Michael Sukram, a forensic pathologist at Western University in London, and the director of the Motor Vehicle Safety, also known as MOVES, research team funded by Transport Canada. I'll turn it over to you, Mahim.
Hello. Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Okay, so my PhD project is based on pedestrian and cyclist fatalities within the province of Ontario, but for today's presentation, I'm representing the Motor Vehicle Safety Research Team, the Provincial Forensic Pathology Unit in Toronto, as well as Transport Canada. And the presentation outline for today is as follows. So the United Nations estimates that 1.35 million fatalities occur due to road traffic accidents, more than half of which involve pedestrians, cyclists, and motorcyclists. According to the WHO Global Status Report, and of September of last year, a pedestrian will die every 1 minute and 40 seconds, while a cyclist every 8 minutes, which means that by the time I'm done with this presentation, at least 7 pedestrians and 2 cyclists would have lost their lives. The same report also states that one of the leading causes of pedestrian and cyclist fatalities or road traffic injuries to children and young adults, all the way to youth actually, from 5 to 29 years, is road traffic injuries. According to the International Road Traffic Safety Data and Analysis Group for Canada, we saw an increase of 7% and 2.5% fatalities among pedestrians and cyclists in 2018 compared to 2017. And according to Parachute Canada, and as mentioned by Dr. Ian Pike, that pedestrian injuries was one of the leading causes of injury-related deaths to children aged 14 and younger. Now, pedestrian detection systems with automatic emergency braking is a collision avoidance safety feature that has a potential to either reduce or prevent injuries in vulnerable road users that have collided with a motor vehicle. So of course, it becomes important to compare the data for these crash avoidance features with real-world collision scenarios to assess these technologies and provide data and justification for design improvements. So factors such as lighting, vehicle body type, collision configuration, impact speed, and vulnerable road user age, as well as pre-crash actions were of importance to us. So one of the objectives of the study is to compare real-world fatal vulnerable road user crashes with the design criteria of current pedestrian detection systems with automatic emergency braking on a cohort of fatal pediatric pedestrian and cyclist collisions in Ontario. So we began our research in the fall of 2018, where we conducted an extensive literature review on pedestrians that were involved in a motor vehicle collision, with the aim of identifying what are the injuries that pedestrians have sustained once impacted with a motor vehicle. This allowed us to create our own injury data collection form, and at the same time apply for an REB with an agreement signed with the Motor Vehicle Safety Research Team, the Office of the Chief Coroner for Ontario, and Transport Canada. And basically what we wanted to do was look at all of the pedestrian and cyclist fatalities within that have been examined at the Provincial Forensic Pathology Unit based in Toronto. Once we received our REB approval, me and my colleague Allison visited the unit to look at the injury database as well as the collision database. So we looked at the coroner investigation statements, the post-mortem reports, the toxicology reports, as well as the police motor vehicle accident reports. So once we completed our data extraction, Because our project is a multifaceted study, we thought we would benefit with an even larger sample size. And so we decided to apply for a new REB to look at all of the provincial cases between 2013 and 2018. So that has been divided into the injury database as well as the collision database. So as the data was being extracted for the injury database, I completed the abbreviated injury scale course with the AAAM for the injury coding. So to base all of the injuries based on severity, while my colleague looked at additional media information such as news articles, collision images, scene maps, and scene images. And currently we are organizing the database. We have a little over 730 pedestrians and cyclists within our database, which are currently being organized into the kinematics, which is the trajectory followed by the pedestrians and cyclists on impact, the impact speeds, as well as whether the cases were run over or not. For today's analysis, we're just going to be focusing on the pediatric cases. And here are the results. So we've defined the pediatric cases here as children 17 years or under. And between 2013 and 2021, we collected data on 48 vulnerable road users, of which 38 were pedestrians and 10 were cyclists. 34 were under the age of 14 years and 14 were between 15 to 17 years of age. What you're seeing here is basically the distribution based on the year. So higher for 2013, and then you see a downshift shift and an uptrend for 2016 and 2017. However, the focus for today is to look at the conditions at which these accidents occurred. And they occurred in urban areas, clear weather conditions, dry road surfaces, and in daylight lighting, which for today's pedestrian detection systems with automatic emergency braking is sort of considered an ideal case scenario. When we look at the impact speeds and distributions, what was very interesting to find is that majority of the runover cases occurred at low speeds, under 30 kilometers per hour. And even if you look at the overall distribution, 29 out of the 48 cases occurred at speeds under 50 kilometers per hour. When we talk about the kinematics, which is the trajectory followed on impact by a pedestrian and cyclist, majority of these kinematics were forward projections. And again, 3/4 of the 19 runover cases occurred at speeds under 30 kilometers per hour. Majority of the cyclists, which is 6 out of 10, had a wrap or wall type trajectory, of which over 50% had windshield contact. When we talk about the most prominent or common vehicle type, while cars predominated in 15 out of 48, if you look at light trucks and vans, which comprise of pickups, minivans, SUVs, and vans, they comprise 16 out of the 48, with pickup trucks predominating the group. When we talk about heavy vehicles, which are heavy trucks and transit buses, 4 out of the 5 occurred at speeds under 30 kilometers per hour, and these children were run over. When we talk about collision configuration, majority of the vehicles were going ahead, so about 65% of them. But what was interesting to look at in terms of the collision configuration, it's quite small there, but majority of the children were struck from the far side, which is seen in configuration number 11, 13, and 15, compared to the near side, which is seen in collision configuration 10, 12, and 14, which again, if you think about these pedestrian detection systems, provides it a little bit more time to sort of react. When we look at the pre-crash action from the road users, what we found was that children under the age of 14 were crossing with the right of way with no traffic control in most of the instances, compared to adolescents who were crossing without the right of way and walking on the roadway with traffic. Now, this is an area that I sort of focus on. And what we're seeing here basically is that between 2013 and 2018, we collected data on 25 pediatric cases under the age of 14 years. And what we found very interesting was that in nearly 50% of the children, we found brainstem injuries. To the best of our knowledge, we are the first to report such a high incidence of brainstem injuries for children that have been struck by a motor vehicle. And over 50% of them had an upper cervical spine trauma, which is called an atlanto-occipital dislocation. It's basically a dislocation of the base of the skull with the first cervical bone, so the dislocation of the head from the neck, which was seen in 56% of the cases. 72% of the vehicles involved here were broad front or high profile vehicles. Now, when you look at injury patterns in literature for the pediatric population, you'll always come across the Waddell's triad, which is identified as a fractured femoral shaft, intrathoracic or intra-abdominal injuries, and contralateral head injury. However, when we reviewed the Waddell and Drucker's 1971 paper, we found that the sample size was 10 adults, the youngest of whom was 21 years of age. However, we still see the Waddell's triad applied to the pediatric population. And just for reference, the original Waddell's triad was injury about the knee, injury to the hip or pelvis, and craniocerebral injury. So we wanted to look at what were the injury patterns for the 25 cases that we had. And again, wasn't surprising to see, but we divided this further into 0 to 5, 6 to 10, and 11 to 14, and identified a dyad, triad, and a tetrad. And even if we look at the overall distribution of these injury patterns, the Waddell's triad, whether we look at the modified or the original, did not apply to the pediatric population within our sample size. What was also very interesting to see is whether a child was struck and projected or struck and run over, they showed no differences in injury severity based on body location. So the significance here is basically fatal pediatric collisions under 14 years almost always occurred in lighted conditions and typically involved low speeds and run over. Large vehicles played a major role in low speed vehicle run over collisions, which were 4 out of 5 that occurred at speeds under 30 kilometers per hour. What this paper has shown is that if pedestrian detection systems with automatic emergency braking systems were available in these vehicles, at least 52% of these children may have survived. Collisions with turning vehicles were common, and my colleague Allison will be presenting tomorrow on this topic. So there are current limitations with the Transport Canada NCAP and the Euro NCAP testing, where the mannequins used for children is based on a 7-year-old child. However, in our study, we found that 20 children out of the 48 were under the age of 6 years, and our basic recommendations is to have mannequins that are more representative of the sample size or are more representative of the population that are being affected. The study had also found that there is a higher potential for false positive detections in turning collisions, and this is because the current systems look at or try to predict pedestrian and cyclist positions based on time and space, and when a vehicle is turning, that becomes quite a difficult task. So what we're recommending here is basically to continuously monitor both not just the injured, but also the fatal pedestrian and cyclist collisions, which can be used for future ADS systems to be a little bit more effective because of the constantly changing field performance characteristics. I'd like to thank the Motor Vehicle Safety Research Team, Transport Canada, the Provincial Forensic Pathology Unit, the OPP and the OCCO, and CARSP for giving me the opportunity to present here today. I'd be more than happy to take any questions. Thank you. Yep. So basically, the vehicles that were in the study had no safety feature at all. All of these vehicles are probably about 10 years older. So when we compare that to the detection systems that are available to date, what we see is that these are ideal case scenarios, to have a straight road, dry conditions, clear weather conditions, because we do understand that these systems may fail when it's a dark environment without light, proper lighting. So the basic thing here is to have these systems in place, but also to look at how our children are currently being affected, especially the fatal pediatric and cyclist cases, to see if there are any additional informations that could provide us in terms of impact, in terms of speed, in terms of the VRU crash action that can be provided to these detection system manufacturers to sort of have them added on so that, in future, such events could be avoided. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. So do you have the proportion of feedback of at the moment of the accident?
So all of these were fatal cases.
Yeah, but how many were died immediately after the
So you're talking about the survival time. We do have that for the 25 cases. Out of the 25 cases, there were 8 cases that actually had a survival time that ranged from 2 hours to 48 hours. The remaining had died on the scene. Yes. While I'm not collecting the arrival times, I am looking at survival time only as one of our side projects. So I wouldn't be sure of how long it took for the ambulance to sort of respond. But again, if I think about, 2-hour to 48-hour survival, I'd say it would have been pretty soon. At least I would be guessing, but under the hour, because what would happen then is I would have to add that time as well to the survival time. So if you just look at the survival time itself, we're not really talking about a big difference in that timeline. Yes, I think all of them were just trauma centers, emergency departments. Yes. Any more questions? Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks so much, Mahim. Okay, now for our last presenter, I would like to bring up Santosh Kumar Uprajhiya. I'm pronouncing that right. Santosh he's completed his bachelor degree in public health at the Institute of Medicine in Kathmandu, Nepal. He's currently completing his research master's degree in health sciences at the University of Sherbrooke in Quebec. He has more than 3 years working experience between 2016 to 2019 as a public health officer in the Ministry of Health, Government of Nepal in Kathmandu. Over to you, Santosh.
Good.
Yeah.
Hello, mic testing. Good. Thank you so very much, Julie, for this beautiful introduction. My name is Santosh. I'm doing my research master's degree at University of Sherbrooke. I'm originally from Nepal. Thank you so very much, Kash, for giving me this great opportunity to present my systematic review on the effectiveness of policies that regulate booster seats among the children aged 4 to 8 years old. This systematic review was supervised by my professor Marie-Claude Waymet and Jose Ignacio. Marie-Claude is also director of Research Network Safety, Road Safety in Quebec, which brings different researchers and different private and public sectors working in the field of road safety in Canada, around the Quebec and all over the Canada. So, excuse me, sorry, I think you just clicked the previous presentation. sorry to, please, I'm sorry. I think we need this is the, yeah, it's okay. No, this is not the correct. It's 23, I need 18. Good. It's 18. Yes, I think that's okay. Oh, good. Yeah, that's great. Good. Yeah, no problem. Sorry for the disturbance. Technical issues. So yes, we'll start with the background and the very well known information in this panel. So in India 2019, among the 5 to 14 years of age group, more than road traffic crashes was the first leading cause of death, causing more than 55,000 deaths around the world. So when you see the trend of road traffic crashes among 5 to 14 years old children in around the world, in 1990, it was the third leading cause of death, causing more than 100,000 deaths around the world globally. And from the year 2000, it is constantly #1 leading cause of death around the world. So what generally happens in the crashes whenever crash events occur? Well, in general, we see 3 types of collision whenever the crash events or impact occurs between the car, depending upon the interaction between the vehicle and the individual inside the vehicle and the different types of object. For example, if there is an impact and when there's any impact between a moving vehicle and the other type of object, which may be a stationary object or any moving vehicle, it causes the first type of collision. And the second type of collision results when there is an interaction between the vehicle inside the individual sitting inside the vehicle and the different types of interior of the inside the car. And the third type of collision results because of interaction between the different internal organs against the body structure, for example, a skeletal system or maybe the chest wall. So today we'll be looking focusing only about the second type of collision, where the unrestrained, where there is interaction between unrestrained occupant and the interior of the vehicle. So a second type of collision is responsible for the major type of injuries, for example, fatal head or head injuries or the different kind of abdominal injuries, which is very fatal. And it can be significantly reduced by using different type of child restraints. So there are generally 4 types of child restraints, as you can see in the figure, but here I have considered only the age criteria of the child restraints, although the best practice recommends the age, height, and weight criteria of the children. But in this figure, as you can see, I have only considered the age criteria of the children. So we'll be focusing on the booster seats today. Booster seats are generally recommended for the children aged 4 to 8 years of age. However, it is said that it is recommended that it should be used until the child fits into the seat belts properly, which generally or typically happens between the age when the child grows between the age of 8 to 12 years of age and achieve the height of around 145 centimeters or 4 feet 9 inches. So why booster seats are really important? So the previously published different types of research articles have shown that booster seats are almost 60% more effective in reducing overall injuries than compared to the seat belts alone. Also, traveling in the booster seats are child traveling in the booster seats are 4 times less likely to suffer from different type of significant and fatal injuries, for example, head injuries or abdominal injuries. Hence, the booster seats are important. So, hence, booster seats are significantly effective in reducing the child road traffic injuries and deaths. It is therefore necessary to regulate it. So, how does the booster seats regulation work? It really works in 3 related ways. First, by increasing the number of use of booster seats among the targeted children age group. Second, by increasing the correct and/or age-appropriate use of booster seats, and subsequently by reducing the risks of child injuries and deaths among the target age group. So, why this systematic review was done? Since the year 1975, when the first 2 child residence laws was enacted in the country Belgium and Denmark, until the year 2018, more than 80 countries had national level child residence law in the world. Among those 80% countries, more than 50% of countries, more than 50%, less than 50% of countries didn't have, only less than 50% of countries had mentioned the age and height criteria of the children, which is up to the 10 years of age and 135 centimeter in height. Although the effectiveness of booster seats is very well known and it's very well proven, the effectiveness of policies that regulates the booster seats is either controversial or it's a little known about it. Hence, by keeping this idea in the mind, this systematic review was conducted or executed in order to measure the effectiveness of policies that regulates booster seats and the reduction of child injuries. So our research question was, are the policies that regulate booster seats associated with the occupant injuries changes? So this review was conducted by using the PRISMA guideline, which is generally called as PRISMA guideline, which is abbreviated as PRISMA guideline. It is preferred reporting items for systematic review and meta-analysis. We set the different criteria of inclusion and the different criteria of exclusion. For these studies, we have set the 4 criteria of inclusion. As here we can see the types of studies, type of occupants, a type of outcome measures, and the types of intervention. In general, a study measuring the impact of PBS on the child traffic deaths and injuries on the 4 to 8 years of vehicle occupants were included in this review. The studies that did not measure or had not measured the impact of PBS on the child traffic injuries and/or deaths were excluded from this review. Also, the abstract or the only weekly publications were also excluded from this review. Search was conducted between number 5 and 16 and was restricted for the date and languages. However, it was not restricted according to any publication status or any geographical area or the country area. It was also restricted for the language for the reading convenience. Only the articles published in English language were selected for this systematic review. So we use these keywords for the literature search to produce the literature. Different keywords were categorized into the 3 broad categories: road crashes and consequences, child and restraints, and finally legislation. Among these 3 different headings, the keywords related to each headings were identified, and search were carried out was carried out using various proximity operator when necessary. So I have put these things in the index section. If the further information can be explored about the keywords what keywords were used for the exploring the research, building the research literature. There are different 6 types of databases that were used in the systematic review: EMED, APA Psychoinfo, CINAHL Plus with full text, Midline with full text, SocioIndex, and SocioIndex with full text. So this is the flow diagram that was adopted from Moyer et al. 2009. Out of 1,965 articles that were identified, 8 were selected for this systematic review. This is the overview of the studies that were selected for this systematic review. All the selected articles, among the 8 articles that were selected for this systematic review, 5 were conducted in the United States, 1 in Canada, 1 in Australia, and 1 in Israel. All the selected articles had measured injury and death rate outcome, whereas some of the articles, for example, Branion-Calles et al. And some other articles had also measured the other outcomes, for example, child restraint system use and the sitting position. So this is the overall finding of this systematic review. Here we can see a lot of information, but we'll go through some of the selected information. We'll see the study that was conducted by Uprajhiya et al., which was conducted in 5 states of United States, had compared the crash data before and after the implementation of the booster seats in those states, and found that the overall injuries rate was decreased by around 5%, whereas the fatal injuries was decreased by 17% after implementation of booster seat legislation in those 5 states. The studies also found that the child restraint system use were increased by 3-folds, whereas the sitting position sitting position in the rear seat was increased from 78%, which was before the implementation of the booster seats, to 88% after the implementation of the booster seats. Similarly, under a study which was conducted in the New York State of United States by Sun et al. In 2010, using almost the same study design, pre-post evaluation of the road traffic crashes data, also found that the newly upgraded booster seat legislation was significantly associated with the 18% of reduction of total type of injuries, whereas 25% of reduction in the visible or fatal type of injuries. He also found that the team also found that the child restraint system were increased by the 72%, and the sitting position frontal seat ride were decreased by around 45%. However, there was one study which was conducted in 2020 in Australia, found that the booster seat legislations are not significantly associated with the decrease in the road traffic fatalities or road traffic injuries. So we examined that the PBS or policies that regulate booster seats have high reduction in the severe injuries relative to the fatalities. Also, he examined that the PBS have increased the CRS use and increase in the rear seat rides, hence decrease in the frontal seat ride. So how can the policy PBS can be improved? Well, except the booster seat legislation, there are other interventions, for example, education, incentives, and free distribution of the booster seats, which are constantly related with the increase in the booster seat uses. For example, the study done by Erie et al. In 2006 and Jaza et al. 2001 found that the education measures, along with the other interventions, for example, incentives or free booster seat distributions, had significantly increased in the booster seat uses among the children age group 4 to 8 years of age. However, Jaza et al., the study was only done in the 0 to 4 years of age group. And Jaza et al. Also has found that the education only intervention has less impact on the increase in the booster seats than compared to the education plus incentive program or education plus free booster seat distribution program. So back to our research question. So our research question, where are the PBS associated with the child occupant injury changes? Yes, we found that the review found that the PBS reduces the child injuries and deaths by increasing the CRS use and by decreasing the frontal seat rides, hence increasing the rear seat ride among the 4 to 8 years of child occupant. And the objective was the effectiveness of current studies was to explore the effectiveness of policies that regulate booster seats or PBS and reduction in the child injury. Hence, this study found that the effectiveness of PBC in reducing child traffic injuries and deaths were ranges from 5 to 21%. So what can be concluded from this study? By doing rigorous search for the literature building, we only found that 8 studies all over globally. We only found globally 8 studies measuring the impact of PBS on the child traffic outcomes, and all of them were concentrated in the high-income countries. Hence, it's necessary to we need the studies that investigate the impact and the implication of PBS in the low and middle-income countries, where more than 90% of road traffic crashes deaths occur. So we have some limitations, except the limitation and strength, except the rigorous searching and screening. Our studies constantly focus on the impact of PBS on the child traffic injuries and deaths, unlike the previous studies, where the strengths of our studies. And we also had some kind of limitations or weakness, we can say. search were restricted to the language because of reading convenience, and also the no transport related databases were used for this systematic review. For example, there are many national and international databases, for example, international road traffic and accident databases, NSTSA, which were not used for exploring and building the literature search. So we can conclude from how the future, this systematic review gives some insight of the future research. For example, in Canada, except the Alberta, all other provinces and territory have the booster seat legislation, provincial booster seat legislation. However, when you see about the studies that measuring the impact of PBS in reducing the child traffic injuries and deaths were almost not done. The very recent studies was done in 2016 by Brubassor et al. In British Columbia, except that there is no any other studies measuring the impact of PBS. Hence, the studies measuring the impact of PBS in Canada are required. And second feature research that this review insights is the investigation of impact of PBS in low and middle income countries, which has implemented the PBS system in their countries, because all the studies mostly concentrated to the United States and some in Canada. But in the developed high income countries, less than 10% of total road traffic crashes occurs, but 100% of research are concentrated in the high income countries. Since this systematic review give us insight to conduct the research in the low and middle income countries where more than 90% of road traffic crashes occurs. Thank you so very much. This panel is open to questions. There are some references. Thank you so very much for being with me. Open to questions, please. Questions, please. Yes, please. Sorry, sir, I could. Okay, so that depends, sir. For example, in Canada, it ranges from $400 to $600. In Australia, it ranges from $800 to $1,100 Australian dollar. So it depends depends on the countries, depends on the provinces as well. In Australia, the studies that was conducted by Census et al. In 2020, they published the research and they recommended the government that the cost of penalty, the person who are not compliance to the law, the cost of penalty should be as equal to or more than the cost of a booster seat, so that the driver who are not compliant to the legislation, instead of paying the penalty, they should buy the booster seats. But finally, in country Australia, the government is currently providing 50% subsidies in buying the booster seats. So that depends upon the country. Some countries have provided the subsidies, some countries have not provided the subsidies. For example, in USA, in Canada, there is no subsidies, but there are various kind of community program. For example, free booster seat distribution program. Various organizations are working on them. Sometimes they provide the free booster seats. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Question? Thank you. Thank you so very much, sir.
So thanks so much to all of our presenters. Thanks, Janet, Michael, Ian, Mohim, and Santosh. Very thought-provoking presentations. In lieu of a speaker gift, a donation has been made to the CARSP Young Professionals Committee from CARSP. So thanks again to all of you. I think we have a reception starting in the solarium shortly, so let's make your way there. Thanks so much.
Yes.